Welcome back, everybody. So into our story at 6:35, President Cyril Ramaphosa has proposed the privatisation of some main train routes in South Africa. This proposal is part of government's new economic recovery plan. It aims to give millions of South Africans access to this form of transportation. According to reports, the Railroad Association of South Africa has welcomed the proposal, saying that it could unlock enormous opportunities. Well, Ofentse Mokwena, a transport economist, joins us to discuss this. Good to have you. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And good morning to viewers.
So, start off. Tell us, what do you think of privatizing some of the different routes that are run by PRASA?
Well, I think it's very early to say that they're genuinely just being privatized. So the conversation that we're having at the moment is trying to implement the economic regulation of transport bill, and there are public hearings next week around that. And the main idea is to provide access to private operators to railway infrastructure. And it goes parallel with what's happening with traditional network economic entities. So your ESCOM, railway infrastructure and roadway infrastructure are going through the same transition. So just like you have the independent power production program that's introduced in ESCOM, you're also having this untangling of network infrastructure in the railway industry. And the whole point is to solve what's been constantly been spoken about, structural issues. This is a structural impediment that we don't have open access to railway infrastructure as per what's happening on a global scale. So generally it's a good thing, but it also does come with a number of challenges. And the goodness of it all is really has a number of prerequisites before you can actually reap the rewards.
Talk to me about these prerequisites. What would ideally be the best way forward?
Well, the first thing, of course, is to really have an understanding of metro rail, Shosholoza Mail. So these are the long distance and local urban railway services in the passenger market. The other side also has to do with, having an understanding of the benefits of doing or the costs of doing something like this from a freight rail perspective, which of course involves Transnet and other private type operators. Now, the big challenge is that Metro Rail over the last, I'd say, 5 years, or quite frankly, even more, we could take it as far back as 2000, has been going through a number of delays in terms of introducing the appropriate kind of rolling stock or train sets that they need to have efficient operations. Transnet, on the other hand, has been quite focused in terms of their market demand strategy, and they've actually stopped with the rolling stock expansion per se, and just focused on efficiency up to the point where Dalmore left as CEO, but obviously still is in the company. And nowadays the company is changing its focus, at least, and there is a big chance that there's a much greater focus on rolling stock procurement. So the big issue here is that if you want to achieve an open access kind of environment, it's about understanding what that will mean for state assets and their utilization. And number one, the separation of infrastructure from operations. That's an institutional issue. And number two, it has to do with the efficiency of state entities in and of themselves. And so that when private operators do enter the market, yes, the public benefits from increased competition, etc. Yeah. But the private participants don't necessarily, overshadow or dilute the state practice or the state offering as well. So there is that balancing act that needs to be played with.
So, Ofentse, let's be honest, because if you look at the state of the railway networks, they're devastating to say the least. And we can look back and say, well, this has been because of very poor upkeep. We can say that this has been due to corruption, rampant corruption in this particular industry. We can just basically look at many, many reasons. There's the lawlessness that goes there with it as well. Now, what private entity would actually want to go into something like that? Because we know the benefits of having a fantastic rail network which could link, and we've heard about this for so long, linking up not only the whole of South Africa but into the continent, and to do a proper job. It would help so much. But the reality is that it just is just burdened with so much. Which private entity, in your opinion, would want to go in and try and work this?
Well, it's an interesting question because Transnet, for example, is one of the SOEs that, yes, of course, every SOE has issues, but it's one of those SOEs that has been performing relatively well on from a financial perspective. And the issue in South Africa, we can start there, is that we do have high volumes concentrated, or very high densities that we see in our main ore lines. And these are really our bulk corridors, and that's about 1,500 kilometers of route kilometers. But then we have, we're talking about 20,000 route kilometers that are left. Then there's a couple of branch lines. Now, most of these corridors are actually being used. We've electrified them, and yeah, we are actually utilizing them. But here's the real challenge. The real challenge is that there are some corridors, there's some routes, there's some branch lines that might be more efficient if the private sector was incentivized to operate those lines. That doesn't mean substitute to Transnet. No, it means bringing in an additional series of operators, or actually just enabling them if they want to. Grindrod is already participating in this space, but they've got very short routes. And we also, the other side is that from a freight perspective, you also need intermodal infrastructure. And what we know about intermodal infrastructure is that it basically enables the advantages of rail transport to materialize. And we see the same conversation in the passenger railway market. We have a very, very expansive railway infrastructure coverage in South Africa for passenger movement. But what makes it so difficult for us to swallow its potential is its history of dilapidation and the way in which we've been seeing it being utilized. But if there's a shift towards enabling private operators to use the infrastructure, then what happens, or what is expected to happen at least, is that you start to derive greater economies of scale. You start having more efficient and competitive operations. But the lines do exist that we can work with. It's not like we don't have workable corridors. It's just that the train terminals or the stations or the transport interchanges that we've had over the last couple of years have, in the passenger market, have not been integrated into the local networks. Yeah. And that's where the lack of completion in terms of the trip starts to basically materialize. And for railways, that's a big competitive disadvantage. What you want is for someone to be able to wake up in the morning, catch a taxi to a train station, and actually save travel time and money to get to work. What we're seeing, however, is that new rolling stock with higher speeds is being introduced into the urban network, whereas those speeds, you don't really see them unless if you're moving along a very long distance type corridor. And that takes us to the continental conversation, which we can discuss as well.
Let's try and get into the local transportation at the moment, because when you look at the state of PRASA at the moment, their cash reserves are basically empty. The railway networks are basically all but destroyed. I'm not saying every one of them, but it's in a dire situation at the moment. And this is public money. This is money that has been pumped in by the state, and now to just leave it and say, okay, well, there's not much we can do now. Let's bring the private sector in, and that I imagine will leave a very bitter taste in the mouths of many. And when you look at the numbers of what's going on currently, Mabopane Tshwane train route, daily services, they've been cut from 388 trains to just 79. This is 360,000 commuters that have basically been stranded due to the bad infrastructure and everything else that has gone with this. If this private partnership comes about, will the state still have an obligation to actually take care of the infrastructure or the tracks? Or how does it actually work?
Oh, okay. That's a brilliant question. So let's start it like this. For passenger railways, it's very easy to over aggregate, meaning we take PRASA and we turn it into just this giant national kind of conversation. Whereas urban networks are actually localized. So they're in the Western Cape, they are in the KZN, they are in Gauteng, they're in the Eastern Cape. And these railway lines, these urban networks, where you're really trying to have efficient passenger operations, might actually need to be sort of devolved. And devolution is a really difficult topic, but the idea that we've seen already from the Western Cape and also a bit of it in Gauteng through the Gautrain is that provinces are trying to get a grip of the railway networks at least the passenger rail operations, within their jurisdiction. And that's important because what you have then is you have a much more localized degree of efficiency and also assessment of the utilization of this kind of infrastructure. When we over-aggregate it and look at the entire market from, a national perspective, it becomes very difficult to analyze, whether KZN is, getting the right revenues per seat kilometers or not, and how that introduction of private operators is going to work. You'll find that, for example, every province might have a different bundle of operators that they want to regulate. And that's really, through the transport authorities, and that's an institutional requirement. On the other hand, from the freight transport perspective, if you really want to bring, private entities into the ball, the state will still be able to retain and manage and in fact expand infrastructure through the access pricing. So just like you have, road tolling, the operators will be expected to pay a fee or a price to use the specific stretch of railway infrastructure. And it's standard practice on a global scale. But in South Africa, there are a number of issues that we need to deal with, and I could, just highlight a few. The first one is rolling stock. At the moment, we sort of trying to adopt the Luxembourg protocol, rail protocol, which focuses on enabling private entities to basically be able to bring in rolling stock into the market through a leasing arrangement. Instead of owning rail train sets, you can lease them and then use them, for operations. We also need to have leasing companies and institute regulations around that. We also need to have train operating companies and their regulations associated with that. And we also need transition management. How do you bring Black enterprises into this? How do you transition, the existing operations? How you transition existing bus companies who are interested into the railway market, or taxi associations and entities who are interested into the railway market, particularly from a passenger perspective.
Okay, Ofentse, I'm going to throw quick questions at you if you can be quite quick with your answers. We're seeing...
Okay, yes, I will.
Not a problem, just because we're running into time problems and I want to get a lot out of you. But we're seeing what the idea is that this is supposedly the idea is meant to start with Gauteng and the Western Cape. Would these trains therefore be obviously for the day-to-day commuters, and what type of trains and what sort of costs are we looking at to try and get this thing off the ground?
Well, the impact assessment at the moment of this economic regulator is really focused on the internal impact from the DOT's perspective. So the kind of labor that they're going to need, the kind of employees that they're going to need, and the competencies that they're going to need internally to actually work on estimating and providing a proper feasibility assessment of the real costs of executing something like this. But what we expect, though, is that the costs are largely going to be internalized, because it's about changing the institutional arrangement and then opening up the market. So there's a lot of internal fixing that will be necessary first.
Yeah, that goes without saying. There's a lot that needs to be fixed there. But just to wrap it up for us, Ofentse, do you think that this is the way to go? We're talking for the ease for commuters, for goods trains to try and bring up, transportation within South Africa and, of course, intercontinental. And economically, is this the solution? Because we don't want to look at all this money that's been wasted already trying to revitalize this. There have been calls before to privatize these certain routes. Is this the way forward? Do you think this is going to work?
Well, the first thing that we have to understand is that we need to become customer oriented, meaning focus on our commuters, focus on our people. We need to focus on the industries and the goods that we need to transport, our clients. That's the focus. And if opening up the market and increasing competition along our corridors would result in more pressure for state-owned enterprises to perform more efficiently, at the same time bringing the service that's necessary for our commuters and our clients in the freight sector, then yes, it's a good thing. However, there's a caveat. The risk is that if we don't have the right regulatory enforcements and we don't have the right monitoring systems in place, we will be shooting ourselves in the foot. We're going to get stuck in what you have termed this privatized environment. And the truth is that you want a multi-sectoral environment for the utilization of infrastructure. The infrastructure remains the state's ownership. It doesn't shift, but the operations can definitely be spread across various operators on condition that it's customer oriented.
Ofentse, thanks for talking to us. Ofentse Mokwena, transport economist, unpacking President Cyril Ramaphosa's proposal to privatize certain train routes as part of his new economic recovery plan. We heard this last week, so this is just a little bit of an update on that story. That's also our question of the day.